Well, I think I can finally say that I can prove God. And please analyze this video and tell me if I got anything wrong, okay? So I found out that I learn a lot from doing debates or conversations. Lots of times it's conversation because, you know, I'm not trying to force someone to believe. I'm just telling them why I believe. And so I had one this past Friday night, and so I had some main thoughts, and so I want to share those with you. And so in order for life to exist, you have to have functional proteins and the DNA, the recipe for those proteins. So would you agree with that? All right. That in order for there to be life, you have to have functional proteins and you have to have the functional recipe for those proteins. So protein synthesis, I believe, is the problem with atheism. Along with binary fission, how was the cell programmed to reproduce, to split? So let's focus on protein synthesis. So protein synthesis is when the recipe for a specific protein is brought to a ribosome and then turned into that functional protein. And so if we look at the RNA world hypothesis, you've got RNA that self-replicates. It can be folded to become a ribosome, which can just do some very basic functions of an enzyme. Is that useful? But to get to where it needs to go, there has to be functional proteins, and RNA is not a protein. And so if the functional protein, so if you think about this, that proteins would have to come about without protein synthesis, without the recipe and the ribosome, right? So we would have to have proteins forming before that process formed. You understand that? And so if proteins formed without the process of protein synthesis, without the recipe and the ribosome, well, then how did the recipe get in the DNA? So in other words, it wouldn't matter. So if you have a protein that forms apart from DNA being used, well, then there's no recipe, there's no record of that and how to reproduce it, how to make it again. And it's so unlikely, it is astronomical, that a functional protein would form without protein synthesis, because it has to be a specific number of amino acids. They have to be all left-handed amino acids, and they have to fold properly. And so it's very unlikely that a protein would form. But if it did form, well, it wouldn't matter, because if that cell reproduced through binary fission, then the protein would be in that one cell, because the recipe was never recorded into the genetic information of that cell, or that protocell trying to become life. And then the amazing thing is that ribosomes, that are the factory for producing proteins, which I'll provide a link to a great animation of ribosomes creating proteins, links of amino acids. Proteins, the most simple ribosome is made of 55 proteins along with RNA, and it's mostly RNA. But you got 55 proteins, so it's crazy unlikely, it's crazy improbable that one protein could form by itself. But in order for you to have protein synthesis, you would have to have 55 proteins, not random proteins. You'd have to have the 55 proteins that make up a ribosome along with the RNA to form. And then even that would be nothing, because then you've got to have those 55 recipes in the genetic code. So you see, this is a coordination. There has to be a recipe for a recipe for proteins, including the proteins and ribosomes in the DNA. And then there has to be the ribosome to make use of that recipe, to make that recipe into a functional protein. And I'm saying that for that process to start, you would need simultaneously the DNA to arrange itself in the proper sequence necessary to produce these functional proteins. You'd have to have the recipe writing itself, alongside you would have to have the proteins necessary for a ribosome to form simultaneously. Because if it was just the proteins forming without the recipe, then it wouldn't matter and it would never happen again, because it has to be in the code. Because if this cell split, and the code was copied, and the two daughter cells had the genetic code, but that genetic code did not have the recipe for these proteins, for ribosomes to do protein synthesis, then it wouldn't matter. So there's the problem with atheism, and that's how I believe I can prove God, is that in order for life to come about unguided, without a mind, so it might be better to say mindless abiogenesis instead of unguided. And by the way, I do not think that natural selection applies to chemical evolution, because chemicals don't care. Chemicals are still chemicals, whether they become something complex or not. All right? Where in biological evolution, natural selection does matter, because the organisms that survive are organisms, right? They have something to lose. They can lose life, but a chemical can't lose a chemical. It's still a chemical, right? So I don't think natural selection applies to chemical evolution. So back to the main point is I don't think you could have this. It's crazy. It's crazy to think that one protein could form, but you would have to have the recipe for 55 proteins, and those 55 proteins would have to reproduce, or would have to form unguided without a mind, and they'd have to arrange themselves into a ribosome for their recipes to produce, along with the ribosome, to produce more proteins from more ribosomes, so that you could have protein synthesis. And then you'd have to have any other functional protein. That recipe would have to be in the DNA. You understand that? A functional protein is nothing, because proteins don't reproduce. You've got to have the recipe in the protein, the recipe for the protein in the DNA. And then that wouldn't matter without the proteins to form a ribosome to turn that protein recipe into an actual protein. So here is the problem with atheism, and this is why I believe I can undoubtedly prove the existence of some type of creator. All right, is that you will not have a simultaneous, unguided, mindless creation of these amazing, specific, long recipes. The average protein, I believe, contains at least 200 amino acids. All right, so that wouldn't form, the recipe won't form, and then the actual amazing mechanism of the ribosome made of 55 proteins wouldn't form, and it'd have to be simultaneous. And so I believe atheism is dead. Of course, people are going to believe it. People don't want to believe what I'm saying. People want to believe that there is no creator, but I think this undoubtedly proves that there is a creator. Because if you look at protein synthesis, you look at a ribosome, and you understand that a ribosome by itself is nothing without a recipe. And you've got to have the recipe for the ribosomal proteins in that recipe, or else it will never happen again, right? So I hope you're honest with yourself. I hope you're rational. But please critique me. Please comment if I'm wrong about anything, because I want to know that I'm wrong, and I can make a new video and change it.
That would be admirable if true, but I noticed that's not what you did when the argument from improbability fallacy was explained to you in previous videos, because you're still repeating that same error now despite correction. Just understand that if you take into account everything that you experienced yesterday, every single event in that exact order, with every individually unique occurrence happening in that precise time, the improbability is already extreme. The odds against all those interactions with everyone you encountered and how they were coordinated precisely the way, when and where they were, continue to build until we reach a statistical impossibility. That's even before we stretch that out to include everything that happened to me and everyone else, not just yesterday, but over many years. A part of your problem, or part of the problem with your perspective as a religious believer, is that you see things being orchestrated by a divine administrator, which means you've got everything upside down, because the complexity you're talking about is an emergent pattern. When you look at anything at the microscopic or the telescopic scale, you're going to see bigger numbers than you'd likely ever see at our typical scale. And the amount of precision that an artist would need for very fine detail exceeds comprehension at the molecular scale, because it's not being dictated from the top down. It's emerging from the bottom up. Then you have the false impression that complexity implies divine design. It's a common misconception, but really an efficient simplicity would be more indicative of a deliberate designer than the unnecessarily complex haphazard configurations of biochemistry. Seriously, when I looked at the process of photosynthesis at the molecular level, I thought, this is too convoluted. This is really not a very intelligent design. It's certainly not a deliberate one. Then, when you look at the function of mutations and their replication in the individual cell and extrapolate that out to, eventual selection and population mechanics, again, we're obviously talking about emergence, not divine design. You certainly wouldn't describe that or any part of that as a recipe someone had to write. No. This was obviously an incidental design, something that came about by blind repetition, literally without a thought. And seriously, if you think about the way evolution works, no God of loving compassion could have orchestrated that plan. I also noticed that you did not post an errata video even after a number of professional biologists corrected you on this very point in the comments of your original video. A few that I know said that you owned yourself because the information of protein folding resides entirely within the amino acid sequence of the protein. Because the origin of transcription and translation is one of the most convincing proofs of evolution, yet you interpret it the exact opposite way. That you're wrong on multiple levels, not the least of which being that ribosomes are a remnant of the RNA world. They're self-assembling and enzymatically active in the absence of proteins, meaning that if you knew 5% of how ribosomes work, you'd realize that your argument is self-refuted. Because ribosomes are the classic examples of self-assembly and complex structure. Their active sites are all RNA-based. They're considered strong evidence of the RNA world and directly refute your assertion that proteins detailed by DNA are necessary, which we know is true because synthetic molecules fold up into abiotic proteins, and amino acids, which are the monomers of proteins, have been extensively studied in meteorites, which contain many of the protein amino acids incorporated into Earth's living systems. 8 of the protein amino acids have been found in meteorites. So what does that say about your idea about God having to concoct a recipe for protein synthesis on Earth? That's obviously not true. But here's the important part that I wanted to talk to you about. We only learned all of this just within the last 50 years. But what if you'd made this argument 50 years ago, before we knew any of the answers? Would you have proved God then? Because your argument is just a God of the gaps fallacy. That's the circular reasoning of the question-begging fallacy combined with fallacious arguments from ignorance and incredulity.
When you guys say, atheists say, we use God of the gaps, you guys are using evolution of the gaps, right? You have things you don't understand. And so what you're saying is, well, the chemicals evolved into that.
No, that doesn't even make any sense, which is why we don't say that. Now you're using the straw man fallacy, which is misrepresenting an opposing position or attacking a position that your opponent doesn't actually hold. The God of the gaps fallacy is when you first assume, without any evident indication at all, that your God exists, and that God explains everything, even though it doesn't really explain anything. Then, because God is supposed to be miraculous, and everything he allegedly does is supposed to be impossible, or else it wouldn't count as a miracle, then you make the additional mistake of assuming that whatever you think is impossible can only be explained by God, even though that is effectively the same as saying, I don't understand it, so it must be magic. While there may be some very few things that we still don't know about evolution, there's an awful lot that we actually do know and can prove to be true, where you don't know anything at all about your God. Not even the fact that there evidently is no such thing.
Atheists do live by faith. You guys walk by faith regarding chemical evolution. You believe non-life became life, but you've got like zero evidence of it.
Now you're using the fallacy of false equivalence because our two perspectives are not equally valid options. Because I don't have faith and you don't have evidence. Thus, by definition, my position is rational where yours is not. In that same video, you also said that atheism is irrational, which is the fallacy of projection, where you try to project your own faults onto others who will not share them. And not surprisingly, the term chemical evolution only seems to pull up religious results. I didn't see one actual study under that name, probably because you're using the wrong term. What you're referring to is abiogenesis. At least that's the name that was proposed in 1855 by pioneer biologist Rudolf Virchow, who didn't accept evolution, by the way. Abiogenesis is a distinctly different series of sequential processes apart from, and not to be confused with, the evolutionary process, which only explains the variety of life, not its origin. Your attempt to conflate abiogenesis with evolution by calling it chemical evolution is a common creationist tactic called equivocation. That's yet another logical fallacy in your growing list of fallacious arguments. Quite ironic for a channel called Atheism versus Logic. I've often said that every logical fallacy I've ever heard of has been used as an argument for God, and every argument for God is a logical fallacy, and you're demonstrating that now. You know, the fact that these fallacies are preceded by the adjective logical doesn't mean that they are logical. They're the opposite of logic. So you should change your channel name to reflect the fact that illogical and thus irrational arguments are all you've got. Otherwise, I must thank you for admitting that faith is a belief that is not dependent on evidence, which really is your position. But the evidence that we actually do have is substantial. First, I need to explain what evidence is, since you don't have any yourself and probably don't even care what that word means. In a scientific context, evidence is a body of facts that are positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with only one available position or hypothesis over any other. For example, the evidence shows that there was no primates 100 million years ago, no mammals 200 million years ago, no dinosaurs 300 million years ago, and no land animals at all 400 million years ago. 500 million years ago, there weren't even insects or vertebrates with actual bones. And 600 million years ago, we didn't even have the first primitive fish yet, even the most primitive fish yet. We've never found any trace fossils for macroscopic life forms prior to 700 million years ago, but we do have bacterial microfossils covering another 2.8 billion years, that's billion with a B, before the first multicellular anythings we've ever found a trace of. The only possible conclusion we can draw from all that is that the most advanced organisms were still only microscopic and microbial for the first 80% of the history of life on this planet. Not one bit of that accords with your fables of biblical creation, but all of it aligns with and comports and supports biological evolution from an abiotic origin. And that means that it counts as evidence, both for my position and against yours, while you have no scientific evidence at all. We both agree that there was a time before there was life on this planet. Now, science says it happened naturally. Religion says it happened magically. Supernaturally. Though there is no evidence whatsoever that anything supernatural is even worthy of consideration. Show me how to test for or falsify that hypothesis. Otherwise, it doesn't even count as one. We know that the formation of life was a multi-stage sequence of precursor steps, and I'll go over some of that with you now. So, the second fact in evidence of abiogenesis is that what we know of the prebiotic Earth is that it was much warmer and more radioactive than it is today, a bubbling cauldron cooking complex chemicals. And thanks to Yuri Miller and a number of other similar experiments, we know that water, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen generate amino acids when heated and charged with electricity. This is not like the lightning bolt in a mud puddle thing. That's a huge distortion. And then the same sort of thing happens when you change the mix to include carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfur dioxide. So we know that these base constituents can form all on their own without your dreamt-up genie. And beyond that, another fact supporting abiogenesis is that peptides can form spontaneously, drying into polypeptides, because some of these chemicals become increasingly complex after repeated cycles of inundation, dehydration, and irradiation, which I know already conflicts with your worldview. Then once the right phosphate is involved, they become ribonucleotides. So we know that all of this happens naturally without any divine intervention. The next fact in evidence supporting abiogenesis is that if ribonucleotides come into contact with montmorillonite, they spontaneously produce strands of RNA, again, without any need of magical miracles. Another fact in support of abiogenesis is that activated RNA can replicate itself, even without the usual enzyme. That's important, especially compared to your argument. Further evidence of abiogenesis is that RNA also builds DNA, and some viruses have only RNA with no DNA, which is another fact consistent with the RNA first hypothesis. Beyond that, there is also the fact that phospholipids automatically form a bilayered cell wall upon contact with water due to their combined polarity, allowing a haven for all these processes with transport vesicles and other semi-permeable channels to keep fueling and exchanging the system. So if RNA and then DNA are already contained within that incidental arrangement, then we have the basis of the first living cells. So it is simply a lie to pretend that we have zero evidence. In the conflict of science versus religion, science is the only one with evidence, and we have all of it. That's why it's not even an exclusively atheist position. There are Christian scientists who accept all this too, just not the reality-denying creationists.
Faith is believing in something that you can't prove.
Neither of us has to have absolute proof of our position, but if you're going to make claims about science, then you do need to show that it is at least justified by evidence. In this context, proof would be an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. We have that. You don't. And with that, I can show you the truth of everything that I say is true, which is something you can't do. At the very least, we have to show mechanisms or processes to establish a precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that at least the possibility exists that what you're saying is true. And of course, you haven't provided anything of the sort. Now, science has done all of that for evolution and for abiogenesis, but religion has never done that for anything. As I said, your current argument is a God of the gaps fallacy, and here's why. You assume that your God exists, even though that's not really possible, and you make another unsupported assertion that through him all things are possible, so that your God becomes whatever is impossible. And you think that anything that is impossible or anything that science can't explain therefore becomes evidence for God, until science can explain it. What then? What if you were a professional biochemist and you published your claimed proof of God 50 years ago in 1969, and then immediately after that, other scientists find protein monomers in the Murchison meteorite, disproving your proof? If you proved God exists by the lack of scientific explanation, then discovering that explanation disproves your proof, proving that you never proved anything, even before science needed proof otherwise. This is why scientists abide by the rule that you can never prove a theory to be true. Yeah. According to the common vernacular, you might think that atomic theory has been proved, and so has cell theory and the germ theory of disease. You could say that Einstein's theory of relativity has been proved twice, once in 1919 and again in 2016. In the same sense, evolution has been proven over and over and over again, with many different experiments and studies over the last 150 years, starting with discoveries that Darwin himself predicted and that others found and confirmed while he was still alive. When a hypothesis has been tried and tested for that long, being consistently strengthened by supportive discoveries and experiments, and never having failed any test ever, it's taken more seriously, and it graduates to the level of theory, which is the highest level of confidence science can have. Now, you can think of a scientific theory as a hypothesis that has been effectively proven, because in a colloquial sense, that's basically what that means. But no matter how demonstrably accurate, how well supported, and unassailable any scientific theory becomes, despite decades of critical examination, none of them can be proven absolutely. Absolute proof can only exist in mathematics, and that's the language that science uses. That's why scientists live by that rule that no theory can be declared proven in the positive sense. You're only allowed to disprove a theory. You can never prove it to be true. But neither can you claim anything to be true or probable or even possible without evidence to back that up, because it is dishonest to assert baseless speculation as though it were a matter of fact. In any other application except religion, that would be considered lying. Yet, religion, that's all religions do. So, even if you had an overwhelming preponderance of evidence for God, you still wouldn't have proof of God. But to be fair, you still don't have evidence for God. You've given no reason to seriously consider your conclusion, nor can you even show that what you irrationally assume for no reason is even possibly true.